Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I don't know about you, but this is early for me. My name is Bill Rodgers. For those that don't know me, I'm the board chair of the National Academy of Social Insurance, and hereforth we say the Academy. So all together, we say good morning. We are here at the Academy's 30th annual research or policy research conference entitled NonStandard Work and Social Insurance, Designing Risk Protections for a Changing Workforce. I first got introduced to non-standard work, contract work, independent contractor work, gig economy work when I was just started as working as the chief economist at the Labor Department in 2000. Many of you may have remembered a volume that was published that Harry Holzer, my predecessor, and others had created. It was called Future Work, Trends and Challenges in the 21st Century. Even today, I still use that volume as kind of my guidepost, because one of the lead lines in that book talked about how the how we work has changed, the where we work has changed, the when we work has changed, and the with whom we've worked has changed. And one aspect of that is this notion is non-standard work, particularly where the role of technology has helped to usher in that. In more concise words, basically, or more targeted phrases, that employment arrangements in our country have been undergoing or have undergone a structural transformation over the past 2 decades. And that transformation has contributed to a risk shift from employers and the government to workers. Developing policy options to protect workers in alternative employment arrangements from the risk of injury at work, illness, disability, unemployment, retirement insecurity, and the need to provide caregiving is a critical task facing the Academy, facing the nation, and facing many communities, and facing obviously many families. Today's conference will help us make progress towards that goal. A little bit of background. This topic or this issue for us really comes from, or is an extension from, our volume that we published last year at this time. It was entitled. It was a volume that about 80 members of the Academy put together, and it was basically a new blueprint or a new set of framework of where we are today on issues facing the Academy, facing the nation, but it was purely provided for the new leadership here in Washington, and that is sort of the impetus, or today is the next step, or the follow-up to, in my eyes, as board chair, to that endeavor, last year's endeavor. And in getting us to here, we've had a variety of individuals and organizations that have played a key role for us. First, I want to thank Ben Vecti, who's our Vice President for Policy, and his team, Elliot Skur, Alexandra Bradley, and Chris McLaren, for conceiving the idea of today's conference and enlisting many of the nation's top experts in these areas to speak with you today, have conversations with you today. I would also like to thank Christine Quinio, our development director, for planning and executing the conference. Funders are also very, very important. Particularly, I want to thank the Ford Foundation for its support of the Academy's policy work, ongoing work, and our annual conference. I would also like to thank the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, Anthem, and Ernst & Young for their support for the Academy and this conference. Finally, something that's been dear to my heart as I've been involved with the Academy for a number of years now. I've actually lost track. But to thank the Hines Family Foundation for continuing to underwrite the John Hines Dissertation Award, which was awarded yesterday to Sebastian Tellatrio. Is Sebastian here yet? Please stand up. Please, thank you. I'm still young enough to remember, I didn't win the award, but I remember being here as a young scholar and amongst so many wonderful and amazing academics and practitioners. I think of professional organizations, we are one of probably the most unique and we benefit from each other to where the academics who have these wonderful, lofty ideas can get sort of schooled and and say, well, this is how the real world works, or this is when I conceived or wrote of that policy, this is what I was really intending, as evidence of, for many of you who might have been at last night's reception and the panel discussion on the Greenspan Commission. I mean, that was, to me, and I don't mean to, I say this in the greatest respect and just sort of honor, but that was amazing last night, hearing our colleagues who were a part of that conversation, who were making history, who made history with regards to their experiences. But about today. Each of these sessions today features a panel of amazing and very distinguished experts in their fields who will examine different areas of risk protections for non-standard workers. The first panel will lay the foundation, will provide the foundation for all the discussions that follow by exploring what we currently know and do not know about to the extent and the structure of non-standard work. Panels 2 through 5 will hone in or zero in on specific risk protections against workplace injury, unemployment, retirement and disability, and the need to attend to caregiving responsibilities. And then the final panel will bring it all together, pull it all together for us, and look ahead to the future of risk protections for non-standard workers. At lunch, besides the wonderful National Press Club food fair, we'll have a groundbreaking plan for Social Security from one of the top experts on Social Security, Henry Aaron, who was also a founding board member and a former board chair of the Academy. So before we really dive into the content, just a few housekeeping notes for us. I think many of you already have, but please continue to use the networking lounge next door. You'll also find a book exhibit featuring the latest publications from Academy members and today's speakers, as well as a variety of resources provided by the Academy. Don't forget to complete your evaluations. Okay? Very, very important. That's how we continue to improve what I'm calling the membership experience. And also, we use this conference to also identify people who we want to also bring into the fold. Today's sessions will be recorded, and videos will be available on the Academy's website, and you'll be receiving email notification later on. If you have any questions, please see myself or Bill Arnone. Bill, please raise your hand. Thank you. Or any member of our staff, and we'll be happy to assist you. But to start things off, I'd like to introduce our morning keynote speaker. It's David Weil. David and I have actually been getting to know each other over the last few years. We both share an interest in non-standard work, and we both are, so I guess we're now alums. I think sometimes they call us alums of the Department of Labor. But David is the Dean of the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University and Professor of Management at Boston University's Questrom School of Business. He is the author of the Fissured Workplace, the most important book on how job quality has deteriorated for so many workers in recent decades, and what can be done about it. And prior to becoming dean, as I said, David, he was the wage and hour administrator at the Labor Department here in DC. And today, David will share with you his insights, his thoughts about the changing nature of work and the implications for public policy. So with that, with no further ado, let me introduce you, bring David to the podium. Thank you.
Good morning.
You got a better good morning than I did.
They're waking up. The caffeine is kicking in. Thank you, Bill, for the kind introduction, and to Bill and to NASI for this opportunity to speak with you and kick off what is clearly going to be a very important and fascinating day looking at non-standard work. I'm delighted to see sort of some, both people from my academic life. I actually see former students even, and also fellow alumni from the Obama administration who are here as well. And my task, as I understand it, is to really provide some context to the discussion that will happen throughout the day, and that is to understand where this non-standard work, what are the forces driving the expansion of non-standard work that we see throughout the economy, across industries, across occupations, across educational backgrounds increasingly, and what that says about the kind of policies that you're going to be discussing all day. So I want to attempt to provide a framing around it, and the framing, the way I've been thinking about why we're seeing so much non-standard work and why it has been growing as fast as it has, is in the context of something I've been calling the Fissured Workplace, which is really about how business organizations across more and more industries have transformed themselves, largely because of increasing pressure from capital markets, private and public capital markets, and companies restructuring in light of that. I think there is a lot of new evidence in a variety of areas that I'll speak to that say not only is the phenomenon spreading, but also its impacts, I think, are deeper maybe than we thought about when many of us have looked at the issue of non-standard work, contracting, outsourcing in the past, and I'll talk about that. And I have to say my perspectives have been informed. I mean, when Bill was talking about sort of theory and practice, it is sobering when you go from studying something for a long period of time to suddenly be in the hot seat where you have to actually make decisions on the basis of that. And I found in my capacity as wage and hour administrator and looking at the kinds of violations, the kinds of practices we found in more and more industries as an enforcement agency, in many ways confirmation and a deepening of my understanding about the extent of the changes I'm going to talk about. So let me start by talking about what is the Fissured Workplace, what do I mean by it, and why do I think it's important to think beyond just the phenomenon that there is more contracting, there is more outsourcing, there are lots of different forms of business organizations that lead to non-standard work practices that are out there. And I always find the best way I could talk about the specifics of the Fissured Workplace rather than speak in generalities is to pick an industry. And I thought today, I often start with, I talk about the hotel industry because usually or often I'm giving talks at conferences in hotels, so it seems a pertinent thing to talk about. But I want to take a different topic today, and I want to talk about an industry actually I've been studying for several decades, and that's the retail sector. In the 1990s, I was part of an academic team that looked at the transformation. Originally, we were set up to look at the apparel textile industry at something called the Harvard Center for Textile and Apparel Research. The Alfred P. Sloan Foundation was funding industry-based studies to understand what was driving changes in a whole host of industries. And I had the opportunity to work on the one dealing with apparel and textile, but we quickly found that the apparel textile story, though important in itself, was really being driven by a change in the retail sector. And the change is what we called in our studies of that industry lean retailing. And you know, as you remember in the 1990s, Walmart was sort of at the cutting edge of changing the way modern retailing happened. And what they particularly did in a way that then led to every other retailer having to either adopt the practice or go out of business, was to reduce the amount of exposure to risk that Walmart had by using data, using advanced supply chains, and using what's depicted in the picture. If you don't know what that is, that's for good reason. Usually, lean retailers didn't want you to know what their distribution centers looked like, because that was really the crown jewel of this form of retailing. It was, how do you get goods as quickly based on real-time orders? So this is the period of time people really started to leverage barcode data to reduce their exposure to risk as retailers. How do you make sure you get that information to and from your supply chain, and then getting the goods right to the floor of your retail outlets as quickly as possible? And underneath a distribution center like this is really a setup where if you want to insult a retailer today, you call their distribution center a warehouse. Because there's very little stored in a modern distribution center. You're essentially getting orders on one side. This picture, if you can see it, on one side you have incoming shipments, both domestic and international shipments coming in on loading docks. There's a lot of labor at the loading dock on one end, but then with scanning barcodes, advanced shipping notices, very quickly those incoming goods are sorted, usually by automatic conveyance systems, to the other side of a distribution center, where there's, again, a lot of physical labor unloading and putting these things onto trucks bound for specific stores. And that was a transformational change in the 1990s to make all of that work and make it happen, and therefore, in a sense, shift a lot of the risk back to the supply chain. And there was a lot of supply chain restructuring that actually happened as a result of what we called lean retailing. Well, something else started to change in distribution centers more recently. And that is, originally, these were the crown jewels of major retailers. And they still are. But in the old days, 1990s, I mean, when that's the old days, you know you're getting older, but these were owned, operated, managed by the retailer we would associate with that. Well, that has changed, and that's changed because of what I'm calling the fissured workplace. Because increasingly what modern retailers started to do is to say, you know what, we want to own those distribution centers. We want to certainly set every requirement and standard about what we want to happen in that distribution center. But we're going to actually farm out the management of the resource center to third parties. And so the red box, if you can see it, is actually what you saw in more and more distribution centers, third-party managers. And these were very large logistics companies who took over the task of managing to specifications. So specifications still are absolutely key to the core competency of a modern retailer. If you're a modern retailer, you've got to deliver according to these very quick and demanding standards of timeliness. So that's level one. And that's an important part of what I call the fissured workplace, the creation of very tight standards to focus on a core competency. So number one, the core competency is being excellent in reducing risk, moving lots and lots of merchandise as a retailer. But then we start to see something else happen. The third-party manager starts to say, well, you know, we want to manage the enterprise, but we also don't want to do the messy job of employing people. You know, the retailer's getting out of it, why don't we get out of it? And so what you start to see also is increasingly within the distribution center that might be owned by a Target or a Walmart or now Amazon, another set of parties are hired. And these are staffing agencies. And staffing agencies are hired to actually be the employers of the workers who are doing the loading and the unloading. And those staffing agencies, increasingly, there might be multiple ones even in a given distribution center. In some of our enforcement actions, we found multiple staffing agencies operating in a given distribution centers. And within those staffing agencies, a very common setup is to treat the individual workers often inappropriately, as if they're independent contractors and pay those workers on a piece rate basis. So you're being paid to load and unload a truck on the basis of the number of trucks you load and unload. Often told to come, show up at work at 6 a.m., be ready to load or unload, but you're not being paid for that time. You're only being paid for the time you're actually doing the loading and unloading. And then you're an independent contractor. You're an entrepreneur. You know, you're not our employee as a staffing agency. You're not certainly the third-party logistics company like Schneider Logistics, and you are certainly not an employee of the warehouse. But, and again, this is the third piece of it. I alluded to it before. But everyone in that system is working according to a very tight set of standards. So the system as a whole still looks like a modern retailer system, but the way we are deploying labor is very different. Now this is also old school. Now we're having a new transformation that is busting this up even further. So now, how many of you got next day delivery this holiday season from a certain well-known platform? So there are some hands going like this. I did this. The first time I became aware something was different, I commuted when I was at Wage and Hour, so I was home in Boston for the weekend, and I was sitting in our living room, and I saw a car pull up to the front of our house, a car I didn't recognize, and then someone got out of the car, and the person got out, I didn't recognize the person getting out of the car, and then he went to his trunk, opened his trunk, and I see that he's got all kinds of Amazon packages in his trunk, and he comes to my door, leaves it on the door, and leaves. And that's because something very important has changed in terms of, as more and more retailers, and it's not just Amazon, but Amazon is a prime example, have decided they want to cut out the brick and mortar piece of this whole business. And if you've been following the number of jobs in brick and mortar retailing, it has been falling perilously. And one of the reasons is because there is a new game in town about that. And so if you think about direct home delivery, yes, there are still the kinds of flows out to store outlets, but now you're also seeing another level moving in, and that is companies are using contractors who have very advanced logistics systems that look a lot like a certain platform transportation company that has become excellent in managing people's driving, efficiently allocating people's people who are going to drive instead of drive people from place to place, drive packages from the distribution center or the contractor to their home destination. Sometimes you'll have a single contractor. Again, in investigations we did in my former life, you sometimes have what is common in the Fissured Workplace, multiple tiers of contractor, a contractor working for a contractor. And then getting the goods to the store is this phalanx of individual people in their own cars, treated as independent contractors, who are doing the deliveries, but managed by incredibly micro standards. So even though those people, the individual people driving their cars are paying for gas and responsible for their own costs, everything they're doing is managed ultimately by this larger system whose clear core competence is making sure packages arrive from the time you order to the time it comes to your door by the next day. And so we have expanded the fissuring even further. But to emphasize just how important standards are in driving the system and why we have some very important policy questions to wrestle with and that you're going to be wrestling with all day, is that the system would not exist and all of the non-standard work that emerges under the system if you didn't have this overarching glue, if it wasn't part of an overall strategy of breaking apart the work relationship, and yet, very importantly, making sure you don't undermine core competency through the provision of excellent standards that are enforced, whether it's through a technology platform, a system of business organization like franchising, or importantly, some combination of the two. You know, the crowning piece of this, which I've read reporting of, home delivery companies like Amazon have become increasingly worried about the number of theft off people's porches. So Amazon has apparently is developing and testing a system that uses Alexa, this evil thing in your house that is always listening to you, as far as I could tell. My wife and I have an aunt. My wife likes Alexa. Whenever I'm near Alexa, I unplug her because I don't trust Alexa. But that being said, so using Alexa and a door-mounted camera to allow a delivery driver to be identified as a legitimate delivery driver who will then have some kind of access code to open your door and place your packages in your house and then lock the door again. Or even now that Amazon has Whole Foods, there's an idea that they will come in, unpack your groceries in your fridge and leave. So just wait, folks. But remember, so you have a system that is making sure that happens with security and accuracy and timeliness, and yet now you have everyone going back from the distribution center who are doing some kinds of, very often, not always, but non-standard work, working on some kind of with all of those, the attributes we're going to talk a lot about today, and who are increasingly independent contractors, all the way up to the end of the chain, which means a transforming of an entire sector where millions and millions of people are currently working in brick and mortar capacities. I give you that and I give you that some detail because I think that mental map is important in putting a context around all of the different issues and challenges in dealing with non-standard work. We have to understand it is arising in this context. And I could go into similar detail about how the hotel industry has become reorganized in the same way. I could talk about how agricultural supply chains have been transformed in the same way. They play out differently. What was Tolstoy said, every unhappy family is different in a different way. So every fissured workplace is different in a different way. And those details matter. We did a lot of work in Wage and Hour on franchise system and trying to gain greater compliance in franchise systems. You have to understand how, and even franchise systems different from the janitorial sector to how franchising is used in home care versus how it's used in fast food. Those details matter, but these common principles of core competency, shifting of work, and the use of standards and requirements to make it all stay together is really decisive in thinking about the larger phenomenon. The next panel, and I'm anxious to hear Catherine Abraham and Ann Polivka and the other panelists talk about the data. I would argue, I think right now, until the contingent worker survey comes out, the best recent estimate of the growth of these kinds of practices is the work that Larry Katz and Alan Kruger have done to kind of simulate the CWS contingent worker survey to look at the incidence of what they call alternative work arrangements, what I would call fissured workplace practices across the economy. And what they show is very, very steep increases in a set of different practices that we'll be discussing in greater detail today. Particularly in this period from 2005 to 2015. And again, it's probably hard to see where you're sitting, but they look occupationally. We see a growth in these practices, a particular explosion of these practices actually in some occupational industry groups over this last decade period. In fact, the only occupational group where you see no change and actually a tiny, probably not statistically significant decline is in management. There is not a way yet to figure out a way to fissure management. But we're seeing more and more fissuring, certainly at the low end of the labor market, but increasingly moving up the educational scale, including professions like law. I once, recently when I was Wage and Hour Administrator, gave a talk to industrial hygienists, and learned from that discussion that people doing epidemiology and industrial hygiene for companies are increasingly outsourced. So this is something that is not only pervading more and more occupations, more and more industries, but it's moving up the, again, the educational ladder with important implications when we start thinking about policies. You know, sort of intoning the old virtues of people getting a college education in a world where we know that the premium for college education has been decreasing. It's still sizable, but it has been decreasing in recent years. I think requires us to think about how there might be a story I could give or someone could give in a couple of years about how some of the work we associated with greater skill content and education content has also been fissured with some of the same implications you're going to be talking about in the discussion today. So it is spreading, it's becoming more apparent. I mean, the last kind of nugget from the Katz and Kruger paper I'd just offer you, they estimated that 94% of net employment growth over this last decade period occurred in these alternative work arrangements, which is really an astounding figure about how much greater their incidence is. I've already alluded to the consequences, and I want to just talk very quickly about it. And clearly, one of the major consequences of the fissured workplace, creating more non-standard work environments, is its impact on social insurance systems. And the fact that so much of what we depended on, even without it ultimately being shifted to independent contractors, one of the characteristics of fissured structures is that you get multiple tiers of businesses operating in that environment. And when you have multiple tiers of businesses, with each business trying to get its return from its piece of the activity, that creates greater and greater pressure as you move down or out in a system, such that very often the prices that are being paid at the end of the system, whether it is to contract janitors, drivers, for retail transportation systems, or people on construction and farm working site, wherever it is, the thinner the margins are, the more likelihood things happen in terms of labor standards violations, which is certainly the experience and what ultimately or originally led me into looking at this whole phenomenon. So labor standards violations are clearly one consequence of the fissured workplace, and one that we focused on a lot. Second is really the substance of this conference, which is risk shifting. I talked about how the retail industry transformed itself by shifting risk backward onto the supply chain. Well, clearly an important reality or result of the fissured workplace is shifting of more and more risk directly onto the workforce. My colleague and friend David Michaels, when he headed OSHA, thought a lot about, for instance, the implications of the use of subcontracting in industries like cell towers that had results in massive increases in fatality rates in that industries, or the problems of coordination attendant with having manufacturing facilities that are using staffing agencies. There are risks about occupational health and safety that arise from these relationships. Obviously, providing pensions and healthcare benefits as the employment relationship becomes both more tenuous and more murky. I mean, that's another thing I haven't emphasized enough. It becomes very difficult to say who is the employer, and our laws, unfortunately, often don't provide a clear focus about what I would argue should often be considered joint responsibility for the outcomes that occur in a highly coordinated system like the retail example I gave you. You know, clearly safety net policies, unemployment insurance, the way we think about workers' compensation, which is so baked into a notion of old-fashioned employment, really start to break down in the kinds of structures and business organization changes that I've described to you. Clearly, the whole issue of worker representation, the National Labor Relations Act, was a flawed and broken act to begin with, the fissured workplace really kicks further foundations out of that system, and it makes it harder and harder for working people to be able to organize and be represented by unions and to engage in collective bargaining. And then our whole notion of training, and I want to get to that in one other implication, but who trains people in a fissured workplace? You know, so much of that used to, again, be baked into a system of, you know, the old notion that you could start in a mailroom and work your way up. Well, now if the mailroom is outsourced, you are no longer part of that system. And let me give you, I want to put on the table an implication that I and many other, particularly people, I was at the American economics meetings at the beginning of this month, and I was amazed to see how many papers were dealing with different aspects of inequality and picking up on something that I would, again, attribute to an implication of the fissured workplace. Some of you may have read this wonderful New York Times article by a guy named Neil Irwin this fall, where he profiled two janitors. He profiled a woman named Gail Evans, who you see up on the screen. Gail Evans worked at Kodak, was a Kodak employee, had employee benefits, had a good salary from Kodak, and had, importantly, she actually had part of her college education paid by Kodak. She was a janitor. Her particular Kodak facility closed down. She was moved to another facility because she was a Kodak employee. At that facility, she was also taking courses in something that was rather arcane in the 1980s, something called information technology. The manager in the next facility where she was transferred got wind that she knew something about it and had her train other people in sort of organizing the janitorial function using Excel or something like that. Just fast forward, Gail Evans became a vice president of information technology at Kodak and now is a senior vice president at Mercer in this capacity. Now, everyone who started as a janitor, I'm not suggesting ultimately became a senior vice president out of the Kodak system, but it's indicative of social networks that were part of employment in a previous age. And Neil Irwin contrasts Gail Evans with a woman named Marta Ramos, who was a janitor at Apple. So here you have two cutting-edge technology companies of their age, but Marta Ramos has a very different relationship with Apple. She's a contract janitor. She has no part of that system and therefore will not enjoy any of the kinds of network benefits and certainly not the benefits of salary and other kinds of benefits that Gail Evans experienced at Kodak. Now, that's another important aspect of that is Gail Evans was part of the Kodak pay structure. Marta Ramos is not, which means when pays rise and fall in Kodak, or when they rose in particular, it tended to pull up people like Gail Evans because they were part of a pay system. They were part of what way back Michael Piori and Peter Doringer called an internal labor market that carried wages with it. When you are paid as a contractor, you are paid for a fee for service, not a wage for work. And that changes the fundamental nature of the pay structure. And I would argue, and I won't go into this, I'm out of time, but the reality of what's driving greater inequality. You know, we often think about growing inequality as the difference between a sort of a median worker in a workplace and the CEO, and that's part of it. But there's more and more evidence saying that a big part of the growth in earnings inequality we're seeing is because of growing differences between firms, not within firms. It is the movement away, it is the shedding of work in the way I described in retailing that means their distributions of earnings are increasingly different because people are paid in different paid systems. And in those different pay systems, your realities are going to be quite different. So in the next 30 seconds, what do we do? And I happily leave what do we do, obviously, to the discussion today in terms of social insurance.
That was my first question.
So let me give you 5 general categories. What I want to do is just leave this with suggesting about how I think we have to think fundamentally differently about public policies. We can't just say people need more training, people need more education, because that ignores the kind of transformation I've just described. Number one, I think we have to really think about, when I say rebalance the fissured recipe, we allow companies to have it both ways. And again, I mean, it might sound I'm picking on Amazon, but I've gone through that example in detail. I am picking on Amazon, I guess. On one hand, Amazon is controlling every aspect of that system because they have to. I mean, I used to teach MBAs, and it's fine to have core competencies, and it's fine to design systems to do that. And that's what Amazon is obviously undertaking with great excellence right now. The problem of public policy is we let them also say, but even though everything happening in that system from the time an order is some kind of good is ordered from a supplier to the time someone comes into your house and places that good in your door, we dictate all that, but we're not, those aren't our employees. That, I would suggest to you, is something we have to rethink. We have to rethink responsibility. I'm not saying let's go back to the good old days of Kodak. I'm saying there's a disjoint nature between what we say people are responsible for in the employment domain versus what we allow them to do in all the other parts of product and service market competition. Second issue, and again, it's going to be a big topic for today, is obviously portability. The reality is that people will be operating in more and more in different kinds of jobs and maybe multiple jobs. Clearly, an employment-focused system needs to be rethought in light of the fissured workplace. The third issue is I alluded to it with the story of Gail Evans and Marta Ramos, and I think it's something we're not thinking nearly enough in public policy, is that social networks. We have to think about what is the social network, particularly for low-wage workers, that they used to have a piece of as part of employment that they no longer are a part of. That it becomes harder and harder to replicate the kind of story I told you about Gail Evans, and that a lot of people used to experience as part of a single employer. A fourth issue that I've been also thinking a lot about is norms. You know, there's a set of norms, and wages were set in an employment context. One of the reasons janitors' wages in a GM or a Kodak moved up with everyone else in that facility was they were linked. There were a set of norms that were kind of built into modern employment. In a world where that's now more broken apart, we have to really think about how do norms, the Fight for 15 movement is a great example of a social norm, I would argue, about wage levels being changed by, in that case, a social movement. Are there public policies we need to be thinking about in that terms? And then finally, I want to end with the fact that the fissured workplace, everything I've described, reduces worker bargaining power in the labor market. And I mean worker bargaining power as individuals and collectively. As clearly our system of collective representation, or maybe not clearly, I would argue the system of collective representation in this country has to be rethought, that it is clearly broken down. We have less than 6% of private sector workers in unions. We have to think of alternative ways to provide the collective benefits that unions historically provided working people. But we also have to think about how do we help individual workers in an increasingly difficult, hostile work environment. And that's not just workers at the low end of the wage segment, although we have to particularly be concerned about them, but throughout the distribution as the fissured workplaces impact spreads and affects more and more workers, regardless of educational background. Let me stop there and take some questions. Thank you.
David, thank you. So I believe the approach that we want to take is that you should have cards at the center of your table. And I've been asked that if you have a question, please write that down. And I believe, Elliot, are you going to be roaming around and grabbing? Great, thank you. While we're waiting for that first question, one of the questions I have for you is, is commonly been asked in terms of how, in these kind of the conversations of how technologies change the workplace or and globalization. Do you see, in terms of public policy responses, is it a rewriting of the laws, or is it an updating? Is it that really we have to craft new code, new laws?
Right. Yeah, I think it's both. I think we have to rewrite certain parts of our existing laws to better reflect these changes. You know, one of the most basic ones, and it's certainly something that came out constantly during the Obama administration's Labor Department, particularly in the second term, is what does employment actually mean? How does responsibility get discharged? I'm very fond of the Fair Labor Standard Act's definition of employment, and it's kind of this old school sounding phrase, to suffer or permit work, which is the most expansive definition of what responsibility for work is. And I think it's a useful one in the sense that it says there's a lot that happens in the workplace that might not just be about control. It's about the whole structuring of the relationship. In fact, the test that's used under the Fair Labor Standards Act is called the economic realities test, which is really to probe how does this actually work? Let's not just focus on one aspect, but let's look at the integration of these activities. I think thinking hard about a broader definition, but with clarity. I mean, I also heard from lots and lots of employers about the difficulty of saying, is it or isn't it? I think we have to get clarity what joint employment looks like and how to discharge it, and have some greater uniformity across different kinds of workplace statutes. But I think that's clearly in order. But there are others, as my last slide kind of hinted at. I think there are other policies we haven't even thought enough about. You know, the issue of how do you, from a public policy perspective, think about setting norms in a labor market on a broader basis than we do? Thinking about the whole question about, we have thought about workplace ladders and training needs, you know, in the form of apprentice systems. I think we need a new, deeper dive into what the apprentice systems were about, in a sense, what you know, the systems that developed in the construction industry were, in a sense, a response to the original Fissured Workplace, that any individual construction company didn't have an incentive to provide adequate investment in training, so they had to figure out new ways to do that. I think we need to revisit some of those fundamental questions again. So I would put it in both domains, existing laws and new policies we haven't thought through.
Okay. If you have a question and you raise your card up, so I think Elliot or folks will come by. Elliot, we have a few here. That's in the middle. Thank you. One question here is that in your retail example, which workers are W-2 and which workers are 1099 employees?
So let me just give you a third category, and which workers are paid cash under the table, which is becoming increasingly common. I mean, I think the 1099 story, which was certainly something that's been well documented, is starting to decrease because we're seeing more and more, you know, simply people being told, you know, here's your cash payment, and that's the end of it. It differs, though. It differs. There are different kinds of setups you see in different kinds of workplace arrangements in the distribution center. So we saw flagrant under-the-table payments, for instance, distribution centers in the Chicago area. So people were being treated both as independent contractors, but not even as legitimate independent contractors with 1099s. In other places, you see staffing agencies who are working as W-2 employees within the context of the third-party logistics company and then the larger set. So I think there's a variety. You know, my own instinct, and this isn't based on systematic academic study, but a lot of it has to do, again, with the number of levels you're seeing, and also how exposed either the main player or like the third-party logistics manager, or maybe the what's common in the hotel industry, the third-party manager of the hotel property, feels exposed to handling their activities either through a W-2 or a 1099 setup.
Okay, great, thank you. I was just given the signal from the back, so the question that I just received, you'll have to do that in our wonderful adjacent room. You call it a networking room. So with that, let me close this first session, and please join me in thanking David.